Alrighty, so in this video what we're going to do is we are going to handle validation and operations. We're actually going to put together a standard way that we're going to deal with all operations that can be possibly sent by our application. But I do want to handle validation first. So we're going to open up server shared, and I'm going to create a new folder in shared called validation. Inside of validation, I'm going to create a file called index.js, and inside of index, I'm going to create a class called validator. So the validator class is just going to be a class that contains a list of errors. It's going to be really straightforward, but we're going to use it in a standard way across the entire application. So I'm going to say export class validator. I'm going to start off with a static fail method that will return, we'll say const validator equals new validator. Validator dot push error return validator. So it's a simple factory method for creating a validator with a single error. Then I'm going to say static succeed, which will simply return a new validator without any errors, meaning it did succeed. Then we will have a get did fail, which will simply return this dot errors length is greater than 0. We'll have a get did succeed, which will return this dot errors dot length equals 0. And we'll have a get message, which returns this dot errors dot join comma, or not comma, space, or comma. It doesn't really matter. Now let's create our constructor, and our constructor will simply initialize our errors array to an empty array. Then we're going to have a push method. Now the push method can accept either a sub validator or a string of an error. So what I'm going to say is if error instance of validator, then I want to push all of the errors in the sub validator onto our validator. So I want to say for let message of, or how about error? Error of, well, no, I can't because we already have that. Message of error dot errors, and then, or whoops, message of, then this dot push, or this dot errors dot push message. And then I'll do an else statement here. If we did not get sent in a validator, I'm simply going to say this dot errors push error. Then I'm going to do one last helper method called assert, which will have a condition and an error. And I'll say if condition is true, then return. Otherwise, this dot push error. So assert will allow us to write validation code in one line. We don't have to say if this fails, then push this error. With assert, we can all do that on one line. And yeah. So that is our validator. I'm not going to bother writing tests for this. Although I should, because I misspelled join. I'm not going to write tests for this, but if I did and didn't notice that join misspelling, I would be embarrassed later. That's why you write tests. But anyway, so that's our validator. So we're going to use our validator for our base validation. Now, I'm not going to be validating everything because every single operation that can happen inside of the shared validation, because a lot of things that can happen, such as trying to select a card or select a stack or something or start the game, they can't be validated in isolation. So that validation will happen server side. But some validation can happen client side as well, such as a username. So in the validation folder, I'll add a new file called user.js, and he's going to import validator from index. Then he's going to export const name regex equals, and we'll start off with the beginning of the string. We'll do wd or /d/w/d dash, which will match any word character, any digit, or any dash. We can throw in underscores in as well. And then I'm going to say between the lengths of 3 and 20, followed by the end of the regex. So this will match any valid letter, digit, dash, or underscore between 3 and 20. Then I'm going to say export function validate name, and I'll simply say if not name regex dot test name, then return validator dot fail invalid username. You might want to put in a more descriptive thing there, but I'm not going to. Otherwise, return validate dot succeed. So again, all we did was we created a simple class that contains errors. and we created a basic validation for users. Now, how do we use this? Well, it comes into how we're going to deal with ops or operations. And that is when we submit a request to log in, as you can see in the console here, we want to intercept this request within a store, perform client-side validation, fail out early if the client-side validation failed, and notify the op that the failure happened and this is what the error was. Or if it succeeded, push the action back onto socket.io, which we don't have a server connection yet, but we will soon. In the next section anyway. So let's go ahead and open up our user store. And I'm going to go ahead and implement a sort of fake user store. I'm going to start off at the top with const default details equals object. And we're going to say is logged in is false, ID is null, name is null. Then in the constructor of user store, I'm going to accept the dispatcher. Again, this naming is important because I'm using object deconstruction syntax. And I'm also going to import reactive extensions here at the top as well. Import observable from ReactJS. I'm also going to import observable. And I'm also going to import behavior subject. And then I'm going to say this details money equals new behavior subject default details. So a subject in reactive extensions is a consumer and a producer of values. It allows us to kind of shortcut an observable sequence and push in our own values into it. And in the future, we're not going to be relying on subjects at all. But in this case, we have to because we're doing this all in memory without an actual connection to the server. We're just kind of fudging in this, this behavior. Then I'm going to say this .details money .subscribe details goes into, and I'm going to do something funky here. I'm going to say object.keys details .for each k goes into this at k equals details at k. What does this do? All this does is it subscribes to the details subject, and then it copies every single value, every single enumerable property from the details into properties on the user store itself. Because details is an observable sequence, I can't say this.details is logged in. That doesn't make any sense. I have to subscribe to it in order to get that data. But to make things easier, I am going to, in the case of the user store, I'm going to subscribe to it and copy all the values that get pushed into this details into the user store itself. Now let's go ahead and implement our login. And our login is going to be, it's going to be a fake login, but it's going to be very similar to how it will be when we connect this to the server. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to import validate name from shared validation user, which is that file that we created earlier under server shared validation. And then I'm going to say dispatcher on, and I'm going to say on request, and I'm going to open up an object. I'm going to say a.user_login followed by action goes into, and I'm going to say const validator equals validate name action.name. If validator did fail, then I'm going to say dispatcher.fail action followed by the validator.message. There we go. Followed by return. Otherwise, I'm going to say dispatcher.succeed action. And I'm also going to say this details next, and I'm going to pass in is logged in is true, ID is whatever, name is action.name. So the only thing that's fake about this handler, the only thing we will remove later is this part right here. Because this part in the future, not right now, but in the future, it's going to look like this. Socket.emit action. So in the future, we're going to send this action right off to the server the second after we validate. But we're kind of fudging in this sort of pretend successful request, and then we're setting the details to fake data. And that's really it for our user login. And so, as you can see, it's very easy to write our validation code, and we have the opportunity to send this action to socket.io. We have the opportunity to send this action to XHR, local storage, whatever. It's just arbitrary JavaScript. There is an important thing to understand, though. We're doing Dispatcher.onRequest. What do you think would happen if I did Dispatcher on? Think about it for a second. Just for a sec, think about what would happen if I did on instead of on request. Well, the answer would be we would get an infinite loop. Because if we just did on, we're handling any time a user login action comes through. But we're generating, whether we succeed or not, we're generating another action. Dispatcher fail will generate a new action of type user login. Dispatcher succeed will generate a new action of type user login. So we have to make sure that we do on request so that we only handle the request itself and not the success or error. So now we can come over here and reload. We should get no errors, hopefully. I should be able to hit login, hit the login button, and check that out. We get the request user login with the name of blank, and then we get an error user login with the error of invalid username. And if I type in some garbage here, hit login, we get a request, and then we get a success. But now, for the question of how does this login dialog know that we're logged in? Well, let's have it close automatically if we successfully log in first. So let's jump back into our components dialogs login.js, and we're going to add a method here, and it's going to be component will mount. This is where we want all of our subscriptions. I'm going to say const stores :user equals this context to extract the user context. Then I'm going to say this.subscribe user.detailsMoney, comma, details goes into, I'm going to say if details.isLoggedIn, then this.dispatch a.dialog set, followed by a dialog login, followed by false. So what this is doing is this is saying, attaching to the observable, saying, if we are logged in, go ahead and close this dialog. Which again, this details array, or this details observable, will produce a new value in the case of a successful login. So now we can come over here, reload, go log in, put in the stuff, hit login, check that out, closes itself automatically. But if I refresh, because it won't open again, if I refresh and hit login with the error, now it's saying error. But now we have a problem. And that problem is we're not handling the error at all. How do we get the error back? Well, the answer is we come over here back to our store, and what we do is we listen on the store for requests for user login, and we detect if they're requests, successes, or failures. And then we set a new observable called oplogin that we'll create momentarily to certain values depending on that. But what I'm going to do is, since we're going to use the same logic in a lot of places, I'm going to go ahead and abstract it into a function. So I'm going to hop over into server shared, and I'm going to create a new function called observable.js. And he's going to import observable from ReactJS and import star as a from /actions, our shared actions. Then I'm going to export function map op money that takes an op money, can money equals observable of true. So what does map op do? Well, map op will take in a sequence of events that have statuses on them, a sequence of actions that have statuses on them, and produce that same structure we talked about earlier, where it has a can property, where it has an in progress property, an error property, and a failed property. So what does that look like? We'll simply say const operation money equals op. So op is the action the actual action that's going to be observed. However, we still need to determine if it's a success or a failure. I'm going to say start with empty object dot combine latest on can dot map, and we're going to map it to we're going to have an array here of action and can. Make sure you get all those parentheses right, otherwise this code will fail. Dot publish replay. I know that I'm keeping the map to the end. Then we're saying operation dot connect, and then return operation. Okay. So what we're doing here is we also get another observable that defaults to always producing true, and that is can. And the can property determines, based off of our business logic, whether or not we should be able to do the operation in the first place, such as should we be able to log in? Well, if you're already logged in, then no. Should we be able to click on a card? Well, if you're not playing, then no. And so every time a new value on can is produced, then the entire process starts over and we get a new op. And we can determine, if that changed, if that value changed, without having to do any crazy sort of if checks all around our application, like if this condition, and then open up that dialog or whatever. We can simply subscribe to the single operation. So what we do now is we simply say if not action has own property status, then early exit. Return can in progress is false and failed is false. If action status equals a status request, then return can in progress is true. That means a request was just made, and failed is false. If action.status equals a status fail, then return can in progress is false because it failed, and failed is now true, and then error is going to be action.error if there's an error property. Otherwise, it succeeded, which means return can, in progress is false, failed is false. And so this simple method is very powerful. It'll listen in to all of our actions that we can perform and make sure we're always up to date on did it fail, did it succeed, is it in progress, and can we do it? So we use the combine latest operator to support that. We have to start the op off with an empty object so that when we do combine latest, it'll execute properly. Combine latest will make it so that it won't start until both of these observables, both the op and the can, have produced a value. That's why we have to start with blank. All right, let's go ahead and see how we can use this. Let's jump back into our user store, and up at the top, I'm going to go ahead and include or import map op money from shared observable with the lowercase o. Then to use this, it's very, very straightforward. All we got to do is scroll down here to the bottom after our onRequest. Doesn't matter if it's before or after the onRequest actually, and say this.op login money equals map op money, passing in dispatcher.on a user login. So it's listening to the user login. Then for the can property, whether or not we can log in, I'm going to pass in this details money.map. Details goes into not details is logged in. So if we ever become logged in through any means, then the op login will say false on can. All we have to do now is jump back into our login dialog, so dialog's login, and subscribe to it. So I'm going to do that right here above our subscription to user details. Doesn't matter, I just think it looks better. And say subscribe user op login money. Op login goes into this set state op login. Remember to pass in the curlies here because we're passing in an object with the key and value of op login. And now I can delete this .state entirely. And with that, I should be able to refresh, go to login, hit login, and check that out. The op login now has an error on it, invalid username. But if I type something in and hit OK, the op login now is valid, and we can no longer log in. And if you want to, we're about to wrap up, but if you want to take a look at our observable one last time, that's the code. And with that, we'll see you guys in the next video.